Welcome back, folks, to another episode on It Takes a Village podcast. I have another special guest who has done a couple of keynotes in Abbotsford and many other cities, but one that inspired me a couple of years ago, and I'm very privileged to have Dr. Tsnomot on for this podcast, otherwise known as Brad Baker. Brad, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I'm very grateful and privileged to be here with you, and I look forward to our discussion.
So just to give the viewers a bit of an intro to you, I know I'm missing quite a few titles because you wear many hats, but a couple of things that I do know is you work for the Ministry of Education, specifically on Indigenous education. You were previously an educator for 30 years. You have your hands in Canada Soccer and the Canadian Olympic Committee, and you're also a professor at UBC. Am I missing any other
No, I
titles?
think that's pretty accurate. That's pretty fill-in days for me with all those titles. Yeah, but no, it's I mean, like you're saying, my main role is an educator first and foremost. I've been a certified teacher now for over 30 years, right? And so just took my working hat and brought it to the Ministry of Education and Childcare for the last 4.5 years.
So I'm curious about the name Tsnomot, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What was the influence behind that, and where did that come from?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you are saying it correctly, Sonomot. It's always nice to hear other folks use my ancestral name. I actually received it in a very long honor and ceremony at the Capilano Longhouse here, part of the Squamish Nation, where I'm a proud member of. And I actually got it passed down to me from my late grandfather Ray and my father Harry. And so I'm the third son in the family too. So to get that name passed down to me as the third son, it really means speaker of the family. And so I think my dad, and who's still with us, he's 86 years old, and my late grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with on his front porch when I was a younger kid, um, I guess they saw something in me that I was able to share my voice and share my thoughts, but also represent our family during cultural protocols, and then go beyond my own family unit and my own nation, Squamish Nation, to support others in this province across the country by using my voice. And I always, when people ask me about that, because my own education experience, I had a speech impediment growing up, and so I look back to my late mother who advocated for me to get speech pathologists working with me and all that to to say words properly. And you'll probably see through our conversation, I still struggle with some words, but I think this is part of recognizing some things I still struggle with. But no, it's that's where my name comes from.
Well, you're doing great so far.
Thank
Just
you.
to get into a bit of the history of your name and yourself, who inspired you to get into these major roles that you carry?
Well, I think about, my late mom was a huge advocate for public education and equity. My father was a big time, his family's massive into sports, more particularly around lacrosse, the game of lacrosse. My grandfather and some of my great uncles are in the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame. I grew up playing lacrosse, grew up playing sport. I think part of it, the balance between my late mother and my father, were uh, being an athlete, or showing that you're physically able to do things, but also my mother was big into governance and equity, and so kind of I think I'm definitely a child of them, which allows me to do this. And I think part of it was um, I just remember so much of my mom, battling with sport organizations, or the school district around allowing myself and my friends to play sport. And so I think part of it is just ensuring that, I want to give back to the broader community, and ensuring voices are part, especially a First Nations voice, part of discussions as we move forward here in Canada.
And what's your role with kind of unique? What's your role with Canada Soccer and the Canadian Olympic Committee?
Yeah, I'll start with the Olympic Committee first. 2.5 years ago, I got voted in as a General B member, which is a group of individuals from across the country, coast to coast to coast, that have a very influential role with the sports that we play in this country. And also, we're able to come together and provide suggestions and ideas for the main board within the Canadian Olympic Committee. Many of them are former Olympians on the A group, and the B group are business leaders, educational leaders like me, sports leaders, as I said. And our responsibility is to ensure we're kind of a sounding board to ensure that, we're doing the best we can as a country when we talk about that level of athleticism, but also bringing it back into our communities around the awareness piece of the importance of the Olympic Games and Paralympics to the country. The Canada Soccer Board is one that is very fond to me right now. I'm 2 years into my board membership. I got voted as an independent director back in Montreal 2 years ago, and I think part of my role now is I'm on our stakeholders committee. I sit on our risk management committee, and we just started an Indigenous working group made up of folks from 11 people from across the country to try to strive to have soccer, which is the most popular sport in our country, become the number one sport in Indigenous communities. And so I think that's a full circle for me. As I said earlier about my dad's family being big into lacrosse, I made the decision at 14 or 15 to play soccer and lacrosse, and actually soccer took me to represent our province here, BC, in multiple national championships, and it allowed me to get into age grade Canada soccer camps, under 16, under 17. I was able to play 2 games with the maple leaf on my chest, and then so that took me to Simon Fraser for a full ride scholarship, and I traveled the world with soccer, and I think that's why I wanted to give back to the sport of soccer. And then when I became a washed up soccer player, I went back to play lacrosse. Sport is important to me.
And then you're an educator for you're still an educator, but over 3 decades of experience. Walk us through maybe the last few years of your educational experience.
Yeah, my last few years of my educational experience, I was a district principal in North Vancouver with Indigenous education and safe schools as my main portfolio. End of July, 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 years ago this summer, a job opening came up in the Ministry of Education as a secondee. I phoned my superintendent at the time. Hey, you know what? I think I'm going to put my name in the hat here. I think I need to expand my world a little bit in education, and so I was a successful candidate. And it was definitely an eye opener walking into a position where the responsibility I have is ensure around truth and reconciliation, equity, there's voices are in the thought processes as we move forward in K to 12. And it just reminded me of some of the early struggles we had in the public system in North Vancouver when it came to indigenizing curriculum and understanding truth and reconciliation. Where the public systems that are living it daily, like where you are in Langley and where you were in Abbotsford, they had moved so far along the continuum. And going into the ministry role, it reminded me that sometimes we're lucky that when we're in a public system, any education system, where we live and breathe it every day. It's not the same, but that narrative slowly changing at the ministry, where it's part of our ongoing discussions at every level, which I'm very grateful for.
And you often hear truth and reconciliation, but you're a big proponent of truth before reconciliation. What does that exactly mean?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just, we're all, you and I are human beings. Everyone that's going to be listening to this are human beings. Who knows? It could be AI people listen to this with these days, right? So, but I think we have a collective history here in British Columbia and here in Canada that is complex. And so I think, big the motto for me, truth before reconciliation, it just allows us to open those doors for dialogue. And, this is why our country was created. This is where, the Indigenous population endured some difficulties due to policies of oppression. We want to honor that. We never want to forget that. But how do we use it as a tool of strength to understand our collective history to move to that reconciliation piece? Because I think when the curriculum first came out 10 or 12 years ago, um, around TRC, people just wanted to jump to the end, the reconciliation piece. But
Mhm.
for us to truly, be authentic, we have to do truth before reconciliation.
That makes sense. Um, uh, in my world of work, in the education world, I think there's a lot of teachers and even like general staff, admin, all the way down to custodial, that might be a bit hesitant. How do people start to engage in this work if they're unsure where to start? What would the advice be?
Yeah, I love that question, Dan. Thank you. I think a part of it is is probably the first to people to recognize that they are still afraid. And then it's okay to ask those follow-up questions either with a colleague like you or Indigenous education colleague. Uh, and I think part of what I encourage people to do is instead of keeping that fear and internal nervousness, if you want to call it, in yourself and not trying something or asking questions, you're actually recreating that cycle of not doing anything. And so I think we're at the stage now, I think in 2026, yes, people are still going to they still be fearful. Some people will make mistakes, but I'd rather see a person make a mistake because I knew they tried. And how do we work together and collaborate together to ensure that the second or third or fourth time that they're doing some correctable actions?
You also say go forward with courage. What does that mean in terms of leadership across the board?
Probably for leadership is, you know, especially as a school administrator like you um, is having those courageous conversations with your staff and your colleagues. Say, let's try something different. Right. Because I think the big thing, all of us that work in British Columbia have definitely been taught through a Western perspective, right? And so not once have I ever said, and many other of my colleagues who are Indigenous say, we want you to get rid of that perspective. We just want you to bring in the local Indigenous perspective to where you work and how does that work? And that's that courageous conversations we need to have with each other and say, hey, I don't know how to do this, but at the same time, I know you know what you're doing. So can you help me through this process? And I think that's where true leadership comes in because um, sure, we can get into the notions of professional standards, et cetera, like number 9 and all that here in BC, but in essence, genuine, real, or authentic relationships will actually change the narrative, and that starts with me as an Indigenous, you as an ally of Indigenous people. That's how you actually change it.
How do you personally move through moments where it might feel heavy or challenging? I mean, social media, the news, online. Oftentimes, there's a lot of negative narrative. For a person in your position that has so much reach, how do you do to combat that?
Yeah, I think that's, if you would ask me this question 5 years ago, I would have said I would have, hit in the corner and didn't read stuff like that or get in conversations, the difficult conversations because it was so it's emotional. Everything we do in education is emotional. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. But
Mhm.
probably lately, my own personal strength, my own mental wellness, if you want to use that language, 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, started with I got an amazing group of friends who are non-Indigenous, who none of them are educators. They're vice presidents of insurance companies, executive members of Lululemon, regional firefighter, fire chiefs, et cetera, as an example, restaurant owners. And I think once they started asking some difficult questions because they didn't know, it actually reaffirmed my strength as a First Nations person who's an educator, who's got that background. It's my responsibility to share information, even though there's kickback around negativity. And I think because part of if you use the word like the bread and butter of society, it is creating spaces for dialogue if they're hard, but how do you continue to work together to ensure that negativity doesn't stay as the mainstay? You actually want to move forward.
Okay. Just want to move into kind of the belonging piece for education and the systems. What shifts are you working on? Additionally, what are you most proud of when it comes to Indigenous education?
I mean, for me, it's every learner in the province of British Columbia has to take an Indigenous focused course to graduate. I mean, I just think that awareness piece is brilliant. And I think part of that is just, it's causing not only the educators to learn a bit more, because sometimes the old motto sometimes when we're young teachers, we're a day ahead of the kids.
Hmm.
Sometimes
Totally.
that's it with the Indigenous focused grad requirement, you're a day ahead of the kids. But I think that learning process side by side with the youth that are grade 10, 11, 12 that are taking these classes, that's something I'm so proud that we're doing that here in this province. I think I'm also proud of, when we talk about Indigenous education is, um, the continued validation of Indigenous voices throughout the sector, from teaching staff to support staff to administration. At the provincial level, it's just, our voices are becoming more validated. And I think that goes back to when you asked me about my name around Tsnomot. I think I know my own community always validated me as a human, as a educator, as a First Nations. Now it's just becoming more and across the board, and I think that's where true equity would come into play when people validate each other.
What so big or small, what does Indigenous or good Indigenous education look like in the classroom? Not just in theory, but in practice?
I think part of it is just bringing in local ways of knowing into the classroom, and I think also um, changing the societal or societal narrative around Indigenous people. We're actually celebrating success. We're celebrating what Indigenous peoples have brought into our communities. Um, what the richness of the land base where everyone's school is, because we all want to learn from the land, as we know. But I think that's one thing that if teachers are able to bring in, it's not necessarily a textbook, it's not a worksheet. It's that they're allowing a different perspective into their classroom that they've learned through a professional development session or read themselves. I think that's a big change. That's a massive change in the last 10 years, 5 or 10 years.
Okay. Kind of a difficult question, but what are some Indigenous students maybe experiencing or trying to navigate that educators or society might not know?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us is our society is very hard on we're very hard on each other as human beings. And I think, if you look around the diversity, equity, inclusion file, which Indigenous education is not part of that because it's a standalone, um, is the amount of racism that's still, evident in our community. I don't want to say our classrooms or our schools. I know it's there, but that's a product of the society, I think, as a whole. What we're seeing, geopolitically down south, what we're seeing within our own local, municipal, provincial, Canada-wide stories. And I think part of you asked me a question about social media. I used to blame mainstream media for a lot of the issues with Indigenous difficulties Indigenous peoples endure. But now social media is so it's rancid, if you want to use that term. But it's I think that's just a part of how do we unbox, how do we peel that onion of lack of knowledge, because I think a lack of knowledge leads to racism, right? And so how do we continue to build a knowledge base of people so they won't go down that pathway of being racist? Because I think everyone has a good bone in their body. How do we get that to in a good way?
I reflect back on some of my experiences with some Indigenous families, and there's been some families that are petrified to walk in through the doors because of the trauma they endured generations ago. Is there a way to is there a way to make school more safe for Indigenous students who have experienced some trauma in their life?
I mean, I think that's another great comment, because I think the lack of trust by some Indigenous families towards the system is still evident. So I think part of it is, how does the collective at the school, from the teachers or the administration to support staff, does it mean our first couple of meetings are in the community with the family at a neutral place? That opens the door for that trust and relationship to occur where they will want to come into our school. Um, I think also too, the families that do want to enter the school site, uh, Indigenous families of the school building, celebrate that they're there with you, right? And it might mean that a family's coming and knock on your door as an administrator, hey, what's going on? Is there a basketball tournament coming up? It's not always just about business. It's about building that relationship first and foremost.
There's a phrase, "Every child matters." Typically, you would hear that on Orange Shirt Walk Day, but it's common. I would say once a year in the public view, but inside the school system, it's often phrased. What does that mean to you? Every child matters.
I think the big thing for me is around that equitable. Obviously, it's to honor the residential school survivors and the folks that had difficulties. Like my dad's a residential school survivor, And I know that Every Child Matters slogan is, it just reinforces where we want our education to be around equitable opportunities. And it's the equitable opportunities will lead to better life chances for everyone that has those opportunities brought forward, right? Because I think that's why I view every child matters, because it's honors our great ancestors and our survivors, but also how do we use it as a tool to build equitable systems.
Are we seeing increased grad rates amongst our Indigenous youth? Like, in a follow-up to that, what are your hopes for Indigenous youth in the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, our grad rates are going up for sure in the province. I mean, I look back in the late '80s when I was in high school. I think it was like 20 to 25% Indigenous kids graduating. Now, last school year we were probably in the high 70s, even low 80s in some areas of the province. Some province even higher. We do have some continued work to do with on reserve First Nations learners who are still hovering around 45-50% graduating. So how do we target our supports for a population that rightfully deserves that equitable education, the right to that education? So I think that's part of the ongoing work we're doing at the provincial level, but also at the local levels, with school districts. You
Just
asked me a question, what I feel for the future?
Yeah, about the next 5 to 10 years. Like, what are your hopes now that you're in the Ministry of Education?
Well, my biggest my hope in 5 to 10 years is that, you know, like, I mean, for both, like, you and I and every educator, that we're inspiring someone, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that they wanna be in our seats, right? I mean, I had a mentor, the late Chief Joe Mathias, who, you know, went to battle with then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney on equitable, governance for First Nations. I aspired to be like him, and I think I'm almost there in the role I'm in now. But also when I go into a classroom in Langley or up in Fort St. John, that there could be a grade 10, 11, or 12 Indigenous kid to go, "Well, hold it a minute, that guy's First Nations. That means I have an opportunity to be in that seat," as the people do when they see you as an administrator. That's my ultimate goal, 5 to 10 years.
That's great. Do you Now I'm curious, do you have some sort of process to involve Indigenous youth to get experience in, whether it's apprenticeships or things like that?
Well, the one thing that I really appreciate what's going on across the province at the local level, they have many student forums that are Indigenous kids only, and I think that's a great way, uh, to bring folks together within the local region, but also the the collaboration that's going on with, post-secondary institutions, no matter if they're research-based or BCIT-ish, VCC, Seabird Island College, which is a private institution out in the Stolo area. They're all becoming more, ingrained in the K-12 system, which allows opportunities for those kids to see that there is an opportunity after graduation to become a doctor, to become a plumber. Not everyone needs to become a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher. There are multiple fields and now open the doors for Indigenous kids to be part of, which is awesome.
Kind of a curveball question for you now, just on the theme of celebration. Do you have any uh, interesting story, cool stories, celebratory of Indigenous youth doing something exciting recently?
Well, that's a great question. I think probably the best one would probably be, a group of a group of soccer players from my own community that they were probably under 8, 7 or 8 years old. Um, they won a big soccer tournament, and they're one of their coaches is named Lacey Baker, who I used to teach at Carson
Last
Grange
name?
back in the day, and her son, they won a big tournament, and how they have the Stanley Cup parades after kids win tournaments and all that? They had a parade of cars through our communities here on the North Shore, the Squamish communities, with them holding the trophy up and honking the horns and all, which is kinda cool. It celebrates the sport achievement, but also I think about, you look at the academic achievements, um, like you said in my intro, I'm privileged to teach at UBC, um, and the academic scholars and researchers coming through the university at the master's and doctoral level is awe-inspiring because when I did my master's, I don't know, 30 years ago, it feels like, I was the only Indigenous person. When I did my doctoral degree a couple years ago, I was the only Indigenous person. I only had one Indigenous prof from one out of all my coursework. I had one Indigenous prof during an elective. So I think that's one celebration I saw at the academic level was just the graduation of 25 to 30 Indigenous people with a master's program. That was brilliant.
That's great. Just going back to the sports for a second, I think I saw actually, I know in Langley they did, something called JANT.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, the Junior All Native Basketball Tournament, Langley Event Center.
yes,
Yes.
and I wanna say there was 10,000, 12,000 people that went through those doors
Yeah.
during that week, like, way more than the provincial basketball
Yeah.
tournament.
That's one thing
Um,
I think with our in British Columbia, I think, the amount of, all native tournaments, as they call them in basketball and soccer. I mean, the basketball season is just wrapping up. The soccer season is just starting. There was a big tournament in Squamish. They have a big tournament in Victoria, I think on Easter weekend. And the best thing about those tournaments is it's 5-year-olds to 60-year-olds. So if you look at um, mentorship in an athletic lens, you know, when those 5 and 7-year-olds are seeing masters play and they're busting their butts out there and working hard as a team, it's just a great feeling, right? It's
yeah,
very lucky with that. It's kind of funny when you're saying that right now. I'm coming out of soccer retirement on April 29th. And so part of my Canada soccer gig is the FIFA's holding their Congress here. All participating nations, not just in the World Cup, but they all come here for their annual GM. They have a delegation game on April 29th. And so our head of manager of national team said, "Hey, Brad, do you want to play in this game against
oh
other
boy.
delegates from other countries?" I go, "Damn rights I do."
Yeah,
Right. And so I haven't played, I was a goalie growing up. Right. And so I haven't played a game of soccer probably over 10 years. And so, it's kind of funny. So I said, I'll play in goal, whatever. If I dive once, game's over. I'm done. I'm coming
yeah,
off.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, but then our president says he might have to play in goal because he has an Achilles injury. So I'm sitting there going, okay, well, I can't play. I can't run more than 2 minutes. What am I going to do? But I'm coming out of retirement for this, right? So
This is amazing. Yeah, you better lube up those joints because you never know.
exactly.
Yeah. On that note, how does Canada do in the World Cup?
You know what? We're going to win our group. We're
Okay.
going to win our group round of 32 game here in Vancouver. And then our round of 16 game is going to be a nail biter. And I think we pull it out. And then after that, it's a win. So
Okay, I agree with you. I'm hoping for some from A, I'm hoping that they're healthy, but B, that they can get through for sure. Okay, 'cause some rapid fire questions for you. One word that represents reconciliation to you.
authentic.
Authentic. Okay. How come?
We have to be real with each other. We can't, if we're not authentic and genuine, we're not really being conscious about our emotions, our words, and how we process and move forward with each other.
Okay. A book, resource, or person that you are inspired by or following, or encouraging others to follow.
I think the big thing for me is probably Dr. Joanna Archibald's book around Indigenous story work. She reinforces kind of what we're doing is having a conversation, having a dialogue, and sharing story because I think everyone has a story to share, and also in her belief system, my belief system, every part of the land has something to share with us too. So how do we live in harmony with each other, the land and the people? So that's one book that I really love.
Just on that lens, I'm gonna throw in my 2 cents. Today, I was doing a teacher evaluation, unofficial. It was asked by her, and she said, "What'd you think?" And I said, "Honestly, the magic happens, in my opinion, is where kids are sharing their story. They have an opportunity in the room to demonstrate that, whether it's in small groups or to the class." At the end of the day, I don't think they're going to remember the notes that they were taking off a PowerPoint slide, right? They're going to remember the experiences you gave them, and yeah, I said the story is one way to capture kids' attention and one way to relate with them. So Yeah,
That's
thank you
awesome.
for sharing that.
Hey, that's
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah.
totally. Okay, I've kind of already asked this question, but maybe your personal big plans over the next 5 to 10 years.
My personal plans is to continue to give back to my own community of Squamish Nation, but also continue to give back to other Indigenous peoples in the province and non-Indigenous people. I mean, I think the responsibility that's been placed upon me, not only from when I received my name to my role now, but to when I retire from my position, is um, to drive for equitable change, and that's part of sharing my voice and my story.
And well, officially retire from soccer, right? No more soccer
Yes,
games. Yeah,
one game.
fun game. Okay, best advice that you have ever received.
You know what? It's something that still sits with me, and it was from my dad, but I also heard it from some of my elders, was to love myself before I love others. And I use it everywhere I go now because yeah, as you know, when we were in education, PDP, or I went SFU, wherever you went, some words you weren't allowed to use in your system, and love was one of them. And I think even for a male, I mean, I'm a pretty big guy too. For a male to use that word, I was kind of frowned upon, but I use it on a regular basis now. Is love? Love creates so many opportunities for everyone to be successful, without a doubt.
I love that. You had mentioned equitable a few times in the last half hour, but can you define what equity is and what it looks like? Like now I'm a bit curious.
Well, I think for me to how to find equitable is that um, everyone has the opportunity to achieve a level of success that meets their needs. And so for the longest time, um, through the makeup of our Western education system, opportunities were not really necessarily available for Indigenous kids, other racialized kids, due to the makeup of our system and our governance. Equitable actually has opened those doors where the opportunity is now there for everyone. Because I think the misnomer with equitable education is when we talk about equitable for Indigenous education, doesn't mean we're taking away from everybody else.
Hmm,
We just want to have the same door open for us at the same
that's great
time.
perspective.
That's
Yeah,
equitable, yeah.
I love that. And something I'm going to remember. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you the final word. Any pieces of advice or anything that you want to comment on before we sign off?
I think the big thing for us in education, I mean, I love using the word in my language it's called chen chen sui, which means we continue to lift each other up to the good, the bad, and the indifferent. If we're able to continue to strive forward in a good way, which means we help each other out, we respect each other. And I go back to the late Murray Sinclair when he used the phrases of you must watch, you must listen, and you must show respect. I think if we're able to fulfill those dreams of his, you and I are going to leave this place in a better place than we found it. I think that's our ultimate goal, is to leave this place better than we found it, and the next generation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous will thrive because of the work that we do.
Dr. Tsnomot, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping you don't retire too soon so I can tap into your wisdom down the road one more time.
Sounds good, Dan. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Thank you.